Hey CW Bio, Mr. Kennedy here, and this is your Chapter 6 lecture video on humans in the biosphere. Put another way, it's all about conservation biology. We're going to take a look at our footprint that we leave behind as we interact with nature in ways that maybe we can reduce the impact of our existence. To begin things, we're going to explore a term here called biodiversity. Biodiversity refers to the variety of species in a specific area. And the simplest and most common measure of biodiversity is really just the number of different species that are living in an area. I can't stress how important biodiversity is. The more diversity we have when it comes to living things in an ecosystem, well, the stronger that ecosystem will become. If there's something that, impacts like one small fraction of a ecosystem, well, if there's lots of biodiversity, the ecosystem can absorb it and go on. If there's very little biodiversity, that could spell the end for that ecosystem. Now, where do we find biodiversity? Well, areas around the world will differ in biodiversity. It tends to increase as you move towards the equator. So some of the most diverse places on land are the tropical rainforests, and in the water, you guessed it, coral reefs. So tropical regions contain 2/3 of all the land species on the planet, and kind of likewise for coral reefs. The richest environments for biodiversity all seem to be warm: tropical rainforests, coral reefs, and large tropical lakes. Now, again, when we think about biodiversity, it's super important. When you think about its importance to nature, it kind of works like this. Living things are interdependent on each other. So, as you have more biodiversity, just think of the food web. You have more options for organisms to interact with other organisms, even if that interaction sounds bad, like in the form of food. Living things can be niches for other living things, and in time, populations actually adapt to live together in community structures. So, think about epiphytes, moss, stuff like that grows on trees. It's adapted to growing on trees. If you take the trees away that it's growing on, it's just going to start that domino effect we learned while studying food webs. You lose the trees, you lose the moss, and maybe that's somebody else's food, and the whole ecosystem crumbles. Scientists do know that if a species is lost from an ecosystem, the loss may have consequences for other living things in the area. The way I always like to describe biodiversity is, it's kind of like playing a game of Jenga, and each species in the Jenga tower is a brick. The trick to studying biodiversity and understanding its connection to nature is that entire tower can represent an ecosystem. So as we pull one brick out, we weaken the ecosystem. Now here's the ultimate caveat in all of that. Try playing Jenga with your eyes closed and see how long it takes before you knock that tower over. That's exactly what we're doing when we remove biodiversity from an ecosystem. It's very difficult for us to tell until often it's too late that we've removed that last piece that's going to make this ecosystem crumble. Biodiversity, as I said a while ago, can bring stability to an ecosystem. A pest could easily destroy all the corn in a farmer's field, but it would be far more difficult for a single type of insect or disease to destroy all the individuals of plant species in a rainforest. Diversity is huge. Ecosystems are stable if their biodiversity is maintained. Biodiversity also is important to people. You may not realize it, but nature, in a lot of ways, is a pharmacy for us. Many of the medications that people take that keep us healthy have actually come from other plants and animals, around the globe. Humans depend on organisms for a wide variety of their needs, not just medicine. Think about what you eat on a daily basis. That's a form of biodiversity too. Unfortunately, as our diets narrow, we tend to focus on just a few species of plants and animals to supply the majority of the food that we eat. Biodiversity could help breeders produce additional food crops and protect the food crops that we have. If we go back to that idea of a pest eating corn, well, if all the farmers plant all the exact same kind of corn and there's a beetle out there that really likes that one kind of corn, we're in trouble. Just ask the Irish who had to immigrate to the United States after the Irish potato blight did that to them. Okay? So biodiversity is really, really important in our food crops. Here's the medicine part. Another important reason for maintaining biodiversity is it can improve people's health by giving us the potential to discover new medicines through the chemistry of living things. Preserving biodiversity ensures there will be a supply of living things, some of which might produce future drugs for, maybe curing cancer. This is an example of penicillin that was discovered, well, almost by accident in a man's lab after he just didn't clean up well, going home for the weekend. And he came back and he discovered this life-saving drug. That's biodiversity. So where does biodiversity go and what happens, when we lose biodiversity? Well, there's kind of this carte blanche term that we like to use to describe the loss of biodiversity, and it's extinction. Extinction is the disappearance of a species when the last of its members die. It's a natural process. The Earth, it's experienced several mass extinctions in its history. So, some people say that only 5% of the species that were once on this planet are still here. Now, there's also a certain level of natural extinction called background extinction that goes on. Scientists estimate that background extinction accounts for the loss of 1 to 10 species per year. Current rate of extinction exceeds that by many times over. A species can be considered endangered but not extinct when its numbers become so low that extinction is possible. Now, keep in mind, there's no set number that I can place here. I can't tell you that, well, as soon as a population gets to 500, they're automatically on the endangered species list. You have to take in consideration how quickly they can reproduce and how many offspring they have each time they reproduce. Something like a giant panda reproduces very slowly, so it's going to be put on the endangered species list way sooner than something like the brown pelican. There may still be thousands of pandas left, but because they reproduce so slowly, they're going to be put on that endangered species list. A brown pelican, well, their numbers can probably get much lower than the panda and still not be put on the endangered species list because, well, every time a female lays eggs, she might lay 10 at a time. When a population is likely to become endangered, it's said to be threatened. Threatened species, well, their populations are bigger than endangered species, but still governed kind of by the same principles. How fast do they reproduce, or how fast can they recover from some sort of, malady or devastation? So threats to biodiversity can be really complex. There's all kinds of different things that can cause biodiversity to disappear. Complex interactions among species make each ecosystem unique. And at the end of the day, probably the biggest threat to biodiversity is loss of habitat. If you don't have a place to live, well, then you're not likely to, reproduce in large numbers or survive yourself for very long. Habitat loss is one of the biggest reasons for the decline in biodiversity. Here's a couple of examples where the rainforest is literally being slashed and burned. Habitat fragmentation can also be a threat to populations and to biodiversity. In habitat fragmentation, what was once a large, contiguous piece of land or territory can be chopped up by roads, by human activities. And that means that, whatever plant or animal populations there are going to be fragmented into smaller and smaller chunks, increasing the likelihood of extinction. Habitat fragmentation has been found to contribute to increased extinction of local species, changes in overall biodiversity, disruption of ecological processes, opens the door to new opportunities for invasive species, and it can even increase the risk of fire. The smaller the fragment, the less biodiversity it can support. Geographic isolation can even lead to genetic isolation, so that if these organisms were to ever somehow find each other or meet each other, like, they'll probably still not want to have anything to do with each other. Habitat fragmentation also makes it difficult for species to reestablish themselves in areas. That brings us to the idea of edge and size. The edge of a habitat or an ecosystem is where one habitat or ecosystem meets another. Different conditions along the boundaries of an ecosystem are called edge effects, and these edge effects can be quite dramatic. Different organisms living, along the edge of a forest instead of the interior of the forest can have a massive impact on a population's ability to survive. If a road is cut through a wooded area, the shape of the wooded area changes, the edge is changed. Now there's less distance between the edge and the interior, and some plants might die. We might get invasive species that outcompete native species. With roads comes humans, right? There's all kinds of negatives that come along with this. When an edge changes, animals might migrate because there isn't enough space from which to gather food. And if they're migrating and crossing roads, like, they can literally be hit by cars. As a result, biodiversity in that area is definitely going to change. Another threat to biodiversity is just habitat degradation. This is damage to habitat by pollution. It's basically the idea of taking something that was once amazing and kind of ruining it. And there are 3 types of pollution: air, water, and land pollution. Air pollution, pretty self-explanatory. Now, air pollution comes in both natural forms and, well, man-made forms. Natural forms are illustrated here. Like, every once in a while, volcanoes erupt, or there might be forest fires. But the thing about natural pollutants is that their sporadic nature gives nature a chance to recover from the event. When it's man-made, then oftentimes we change the environment faster than nature can compensate for. Burning fossil fuels is a major source of air pollution from things like not only carbon dioxide, but also sulfur dioxide. Sulfur dioxide contributes to acid rain. Acid rain, falls to the earth, hits our local waterways, acidifying them, and literally kills all plant and animal life. Now, keep in mind, I'm not talking about acid falling from the sky that's going to, burn through your clothes or eat your face off. No way. But really, all we have to do is change the pH of a body of water from somewhere around 7 to somewhere around 5, and the end result is 0 life. Okay? So definitely not something that is going to, hurt if it lands on you, but can definitely change an aquatic ecosystem. Ultraviolet waves emitted by the sun can also cause damage to living organisms. So, another facet of air pollution is ozone. Ozone normally protects us from ultraviolet rays, and if it's up in the stratosphere where we need it, that's exactly what it's going to do. Ozone has been depleted by human-produced air pollutants for years. Products that basically are called chlorofluorocarbons can get up into the atmosphere, attack ozone, and break it down. Ozone can also be produced at ground level, where it's harmful to human tissue, lung tissue, and even plants. The ozone, illustrated here, in the stratosphere creates an ozone layer that absorbs ultraviolet rays that strike our atmosphere and reduce the radiation that reaches the Earth's surface. That's where we need to keep our ozone. Water pollution. Water pollution, again, pretty self-explanatory. When we put chemical compounds in water, like phosphorus and nitrogen, we can degrade aquatic habitats, streams, rivers, lakes, and oceans. Now, you might ask yourself, well, how do I do that? I've never seen somebody just dump phosphorus into a lake, and they don't. But what we do is we put fertilizer on our lawns. We, in some cases, have raw sewage and animal waste that makes it out into these bodies of water. And all of that stuff carries those aforementioned chemicals. There are a variety of pollutants that can affect aquatic life. Excess fertilizer, animal waste are the big ones. They're carried by rain into streams and lakes. The sudden availability of nutrients causes algal blooms, which a lot of people go, hey, that's awesome. Extra plants. Not so much, because once that fertilizer is used up, those plants die, sink to the bottom, decompose, and the process of decomposition literally sucks all the oxygen out of the water, and anything that needs oxygen in the water is going to die too. Detergents, heavy metals, industrial chemicals, and runoff can also cause death to aquatic organisms. Abandoned drift nets in oceans have been known to entangle and kill dolphins, whales, and other sea life. Land pollution. Again, pretty self-explanatory. It's trash, people. So land pollution is all about trash, solid waste, anything like cans, bottles, paper, plastic, metal, dirt, whatever that people throw away on a daily basis. It ends up in landfills, hopefully. Unfortunately, more often than not, we're seeing people just throw things along the side of the road as if they don't care. It's out of sight, out of mind. They don't pay attention to it. It's somebody else's problem. Best thing that we can do to reduce our land pollution is reduce, reuse, recycle. Reduce means we're going to use less of whatever it is we're using, plastic, glass, whatever. Reuse means we're going to take something like a plastic bottle and use it more than once before we recycle it. And recycling means we're going to take that plastic bottle, we're going to run it through a process, break it down into its individual like little chunks of plastic, and maybe make something else more useful out of it. The average American produces about 1.8 kilograms of solid waste a day. And no, I'm talking about trash here, okay? I'm not talking about anything else. That's about 657 kilograms of waste per person per year. Although some of it might decompose quickly, like paper products, most trash becomes part of the billions of tons of solid waste that are buried in landfills. Land pollution is also impacted by agriculture. Pesticides and other chemicals can cause habitat degradation. It's a big problem, and we can easily fix it by just controlling what we throw away. Next area to look at are exotic species. So have you ever owned a pet and then thought, gosh, I didn't realize it was going to live this long, get this big, cost this much money to raise? Now what? Well, a lot of people take their exotic pets and simply dump them in nature. It's unfortunate. It's sad for the animal. Shouldn't happen, but that's what happens. I've got a pond here on campus, and I wasn't the person that put turtles in that pond. They just magically showed up from the surrounding neighborhood. People sometimes introduce new species into an ecosystem either intentionally or sometimes unintentionally. Unintentional introduction isn't caused by the person that walks by the pond and throws their turtle in because they're just trying to get rid of it. It's caused by people that maybe put things in their flower beds, plant plants that are out there that they think, oh, this might be pretty. And all of a sudden the plant takes off and grows like crazy. That's what you're seeing in this picture. This is kudzu, and it was planted throughout the southeastern United States as kind of like, a median adornment. So where the road has the center islands in it, that's called a median. And this plant was planted along that center median. It was planted along the edge of the road to, maybe stabilize the roadway. Well, we didn't realize it until maybe it was too late, but kudzu really likes the southeastern United States weather, and it has turned into an invasive species, literally choking out native species as it grows like crazy. This stuff grows so fast, it can grow several inches to feet in a single day. Exotic species, when they're introduced, they grow at an exponential rate due to the fact that there's really no system of checks and balances to keep them under control. There's no predators, there's no disease maybe, or anything else like that for that matter that can slow them down. So their populations grow like crazy. All right, ladies and gents, last area to look at is true conservation biology. What do we do about all this? Well, here's what we can do. Conservation biology, well, these are strategies that are based on the principle of ecology to help protect biodiversity. So I'll just run you through a few possible things that we can do to help. First, natural resources. Conservation biology needs to take stock of natural resources, those resources that are parts of the environment that are useful and necessary to living things, and make sure that those are available to all living things. In response to concern about species extinction, in the United States, we passed the Endangered Species Act back in 1973. This law made it illegal to harm any species on the endangered species list. That went a long way to protecting biodiversity. Moreover, probably the best thing that we can do, going back to available resources, is simply preserve habitat. Sometimes we think we have to get in there and manipulate, interact with these organisms in such a way as to control their every move. Realistically, sometimes we just need to get out of the way. And how do we get out of the way? We preserve the physical location where an organism lives and interacts with its environment, and we let it live, right? So one way that habitats have been preserved is through the creation of national nature preserves and national parks. This cordons off an area and prevents it from being developed, and it lets plants and animals live out their life and the ecosystem stabilize itself. Establishing parks and other protected regions has been an effective way to preserve ecosystems and the communities of species that live in them. One other possibility is to establish things called habitat corridors. Yeah, we know people need to interact with the environment just like lower life forms do too, and sometimes we have to have roads to get us from point A to point B or whatever. Habitat corridors can be a kind of compromise between the needs of humans and the needs of nature. Likewise, those parks, the needs of humans and the needs of nature can be compromised. A habitat corridor is a general strategy for protecting biodiversity by literally providing under or overpasses for plants and animals to use to get around, the human impact within a particular ecosystem. This helps reduce edge effect. This helps reduce fragmentation. I get it. There's still a road there. There's still the potential for human impact, but at least we're trying to compromise and make things a little bit better. So habitat corridors are protected strips of land that allow the migration of organisms from one wilderness area to another. And it can be argued, as I said, there are pros and cons even for this. The last thing, and probably the most important thing, is just get out there and work with people. Parks and protected areas usually hire people such as rangers to manage the parks and ensure the protection of organisms. The philosophy of sustainable use strives to enable people to use natural resources in a way that will both benefit humans as well as maintain the ecosystem. And after all, that's gotta be the goal. We need to protect the ecosystem, not just for our generation, but generations to come. For generation after generation after generation is going to be depending on the biodiversity we have here the exact same way you are today. All right, ladies and gents, I hope you've learned a little bit about conservation biology, the footprint that humans leave on this planet, and some things that maybe we can do to reduce that footprint to make sure that this planet is the special third rock from the sun, that magic blue marble in the sky that can persist for generations to come. I'm Mr. Kennedy, and I will see you next time.